Great to be here, and great to see so many of you participating in the event. I want to talk just a little bit about the multiple languages of Wikipedia because although we're all here in England, and probably many of us have been editing the English edition of Wikipedia today, that's only one of a large number of languages that are on Wikipedia. Now, when we think about the different language editions, many people know that English is indeed the largest version. It's about almost 3 times larger than the German edition. Swedish edition may be the second largest edition, depending who you ask and whether you count bot-related edits and things like that. But compared to German, for instance, it's about 3 times larger. And you might think that, well, okay, English probably has all the articles in German and then just more, right? No. I mean, not close at all. In fact, only about half of the articles that are in the German edition of Wikipedia have an equivalent in the English edition. And the same applies to most other language editions. So about 40% of the articles in the Japanese edition have an equivalent in the English edition, for instance. And of course, given the size differences, the reverse is even stronger. So only 16% of the articles in English are covered in the German edition, as an example. And why is this? Well, this is primarily resulting because users contribute a lot of local content. They contribute things that they know about, things that are local to them in geographic space, and as a result there's these large differences, and there's also a self-focused bias. So if you go to Wikipedia and you read in one language, there's a lot more information about regions, places that speak that language than about places that don't speak that language. And in fact, when you read about places in Wikipedia that where language isn't primarily spoken, you're much more likely to be reading content that references sources that aren't in the language primarily spoken in that place and are written by people who don't primarily live or reside in that place as well. And of course, maybe as English speakers, we're not always so aware of the limits of English, even though they certainly do exist. But within other languages, this is often very clear to individuals. So survey respondents in Uzbekistan reported saying that, oh yeah, I often have to access content in another language online, while simultaneously reporting in a different part of the survey, yeah, my foreign language skills are really not good at all. And maybe I should just plug in. It shouldn't. It should. So, what I want to say is that in reality, there are many people in the world who speak multiple languages, right? And in particular, linguists tell us that actually it's probably the majority of people in the world. We don't have great data for a lot of countries, but here in Europe, it's just over about half the people. Even the US we think of as this big, monolingual English place, but actually there's a lot of second language speakers of English and other languages there. And I think that one thing that this stands in contrast to is that many of our platforms aren't designed with speakers of multiple languages in mind. And so I want to tell you some work that I was looking at trying to understand what multilingual users, what bilingual users were contributing to Wikipedia and the particular special sort of contributions that they were making. There's some, also I won't talk much, there's a complimentary paper about Twitter there. I'm going to talk about a sample of edits that were collected at the end of 2014. And I'm going to skip over all the details about having to clean this data and how it was collected and getting it to analysis just to stay on time. But the details are over in that URL. So a few key findings. First off, about 15% of Wikipedia, active Wikipedia users edit more than one language edition. Not a huge percentage, but certainly a non-trivial group. I've already talked a bit about this role that language has sort of structuring the platform and how there are these differences in content between the different editions. So maybe a related question then would be, well, to what extent are users who are editing multiple language editions, I'm going to call these multilingual users, what extent are these people able to sort of bridge content and take information from one language that isn't known in another language and import that in and be able to bring across relevant information? Well, the results are really mixed. This graph here, not be able on the recording. The graph here shows the percentage of people editing the same articles in different languages. So we have two really different groups here. There's a group of users who are editing completely different things in different languages. So pretty much that bar is at 0. Every time they edit something in another language, they've not edited that article in a different language. And then there's a group over at 100% that they're pretty much editing the same sort of linked article. So if you're editing the United States in English and Estados Unidos in Spanish, or America in Japanese, or whatever, right? So they're editing all the same ones over on that side. Now, part of that difference in that large group is explained again because not all the articles exist in different languages. So if we focus in on the smaller set of articles that exist in multiple languages, there's still a real big difference, and we still have these really big groups. There's still a group, about half, then they're editing completely different articles, and about half that are editing the same articles. So there is definitely a potential to bridge across these language divides, and that users editing multiple language editions could take information from one language edition, import it into another edition. And some users are doing it, but some are editing completely different things. So just a few more quick bullet points. Well, where are these people coming from primarily? What sort of people edit multiple language editions? Well, if we look at the first language they edit, which is indicated with the language codes on the screen here, and I've ordered them, and there's a pretty strong correlation here, about -0.7, between what's on the horizontal axis here, which is the number of users in that primarily editing that language edition, and then on the vertical axis, the percentage of users who also edit an additional language. And so we can see, for instance, within Portuguese here, there's just over 1,000 unique users in this 1-month sample I'm using of active users. And then, about 20% of them edit more than one language edition. Now, there's a pretty strong correlation. Two obvious things that stand out. Obviously, English is over on one side, just the largest edition. Also, Japanese is a really interesting case here. It's much smaller, but it has a similar number of users here as Spanish or French or German, but significantly, users who edit Japanese primarily are much less likely to be editing a second language edition. Right? So that's the primary edition that these individuals edit. So their smaller editions in general have a high percentage of people who edit a second language edition, the larger ones less. Well, where do they go once they edit? So if you edit a primary language, your first language is a relatively small language, well, you're very much likely to be editing a second language that's much bigger. English in particular is a big part of this, and it forms a real central bridge across these different language editions, although there's other combinations. So Japanese, Chinese here, Ukraine, Russian. I should say this was before any of the current geopolitical issues. It'd be very interesting to see how that's changed or evolved. The Romance languages here are also pretty well connected. French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian are all connected there as well. So there are pathways, and there are this graph also reflects a lot of the sort of geolinguistic similarities, languages that are either similar to each other or where there's a lot of bilingualism offline. So we're seeing that as well in the data. And I said English does play a sort of special role, and here's just to dive quickly into some of the content that people are contributing and trying to come up with a measure of the complexity of that content. And so it doesn't really matter. This is entropy of words and parts of speech. But the point is that within English, the bilingual users who are editing English as a second language are contributing nearly as complex content on average as users who are primarily editing English. Well, in the other languages that are on here, German and Spanish, the contributions by second language speakers are significantly less complex, right? They're using simpler words or simpler sentence patterns. But in English, that distinction doesn't exist. They're actually contributing on nearly a like-for-like basis with people who primarily edit the English edition. So last thing, I'm really excited about is people who are editing multiple languages, because not only do they have this possibility of sort of introducing new content and starting to perhaps overcome some of these divides in the content that I set out at the beginning, but they're also really active. And on average, the 15% of users that are editing multiple language editions of Wikipedia are making nearly 3 times as many edits than the users who are only editing one language edition. Now, partly this is perhaps people who are just really dedicated to Wikipedia, all right? And so you're true Wikipedians, and they so dedicated to the project they will try to help in another language even if they don't have great expertise in that language. But also there's certainly true acts of bilingualism here. There's translation of article content that's happening and things of that nature as well. So I think that there's a lot that all user-generated content platforms can do to sort of best utilize the skills and contributions of multilingual users. In concluding, a lot that I've gone over very quickly, but multilingualism is very common offline, not so common online. 15%, it's not small, but it's certainly not half. As we said, hey, half the people in Europe, for instance, speak more than one language. Well, and even in places where we might expect a high degree of multilingualism, so Catalan in Spain, well, 35% of the people who primarily edit the Catalan edition of Wikipedia do not edit any other language edition of Wikipedia, even though many of those individuals would interact in Spanish or another language as well. So I think we can do more to encourage multilingualism online, and I also hope that learning about the differences in the content in editions will encourage those of you who are bilingual to think about contributing back in another language as well. So yeah, could design increase this? I think so. And how can we identify starter tasks to get people interested? Can we help you find related content in other languages? And can we make you more aware of how language is used in the search processes and the personalization processes that are happening online? And that's where my research is at present. I'm going to skip over talking about some of the implications of finding novel content, but I think they're there, and I think multilingual users and encouraging content to spread across languages can really increase serendipity and help us find new content. And I'll end with just saying that that within Wikipedia now, and I think Wikipedia is a really good platform for encouraging multilingualism. There's more that can be done, but Wikipedia already does quite a bit. And in that vein, the language engineering team last year released this content translation tool that was partially informed by the research I've just presented here. And this is now in beta, so if you go into your user page and your preferences and beta options, you can turn on the content language translation tool, and it will help you try to translate articles from one language to another. It has some built-in machine translation to give you rough ideas that you can refine, and it will also take the links. So if there's a link to another article, well, it can use the article graph and say, oh, that article is linked in this language. Well, in the other language, the equivalent one then from that link, the interlanguage link, connects to this article, and so it will figure out all of those connections and make it easier, hopefully, to bring content across the different language editions of Wikipedia. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.